Hello and welcome to Project Oneness World. Today we are in conversation with Michael Buckland, Emeritus Professor at the School of Information, University of California, Berkeley. He is also co-director of the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative at Berkeley. When I was a toddler in the late 70s, Professor Buckland was already Dean of the School of Library and Information Studies at Berkeley and remained Dean until 1984. He is a stalwart of the information science field, with thousands of citations of his work. His famous 1991 paper on seeing information as a thing has been cited more than 2,500 times, as per Google Scholar. He has written a series of books and research papers in the areas of information, library services, bibliography, search and discovery, cultural heritage, and documentation. Professor Buckland grew up in England and studied history at Oxford and librarianship at Sheffield University. His journey spans the University of Lancaster Library in 1965, a move to the United States in 1972, library leadership at Purdue University Libraries, deanship, serving as an assistant vice president for library plans and policies for University of California in the 1980s, and being a visiting professor in Austria, Australia, Norway, and Sweden over the years. Professor Buckland was president of the American Society for Information Science in 1998, which is now the Association for Information Science and Technology, or ASIST. Since becoming Emeritus Professor in 2004, Professor Buckland remains active in research, writing, and leadership. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview, Professor Buckland, and I'll call you Michael for the remainder of the interview. And tell us the story in your own words.
Well, everybody is a unique individual and everybody has a different story and everybody's story is special. But my story is indeed unusual in several ways. For example, I went to work in libraries and then left to do other things 4 times. I don't know anybody who's done that. Anyway, I was born and grew up in England. I was born during the Second World War, and I was born near Oxford because at that time, Hitler was bombing central London every night, and my parents lived there.
Wow.
So for my delivery, my mother moved out of London to a more peaceful spot. And that's how I got to be born near Oxford. And different people looked after me until after the war, and then I was able to join my parents in London. But I actually grew up in a rural area, a tiny farming village in the middle of England, halfway between Birmingham and Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
And then some years later, when I was 13, we moved into a sad, depressed industrial area a little further north, Stoke-on-Trent, the potteries where they make fine porcelain. My secondary school was in 2 highly selective secondary schools. That curriculum was highly specialized, and I specialized in the humanities. I studied English, French, and German, and very little else after age 14. From that, I went to Oxford University, where I did a bachelor's degree in history. And I really mean in history. I did not take a single class that was not history. Mostly English history, some European. I was interested in economic history and in Central European history and the 19th century, basically. So my parents would keep asking me, even as a teenager, what I was going to do when I grew up. What they really meant was, what profession are you going to go into?
Right.
And I didn't know, and I didn't want to discuss it. So I had the idea that if I gave them an answer, any answer, they might stop asking, and that would be good. So we live next to a public library. So I said, well, I think I've decided to become a librarian until I find something more interesting to do.
Okay.
That's still my position. I'm only provisionally in this field. And they deserve credit. They accepted, they were surprised by my answer. I doubt they were impressed, but they accepted it. And so here I am, temporarily in the field.
And how long has that temporarily been now?
Oh, it's over 50 years.
It's over 50 years, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and
So,
you also mentioned that you were like they said they meant like what profession you go into, but not what you want to do, what you do when you grow up. But let's say if they meant exactly what you do when you grow up and not the profession, then what would that have been?
well, it sort of had to be a profession because we didn't have much money. I had a grandfather who was a farmer, and he thought I should become a farmer, but you can't do that without a farm and without money.
Mm-hmm.
And I had really no contact with industry or business. So perhaps for lack of imagination, it was going to be one of the professions.
Okay.
Anyway, after I got my bachelor's degree, very intensive reading. The pathway to becoming a librarian in the UK at that time, if you wanted to go to a good library school, was you had to do a 1-year traineeship in a library before you go to library school. I didn't like that condition, but it's actually a wise one.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want people in library school who discover afterwards they don't want to work in libraries.
Right.
And through a friend of a relative, I discovered that the Bodleian Library, the University Library of Oxford University, took in 2 such trainees, and I got to be one of them.
Okay.
And I was assigned to the cataloguing room, and I learned a great deal about cataloguing in a very rigorous way. They had their own unique rules. These were not standardized. And I stayed there for a year. And I could have stayed on and had a happy life, not knowing what I was missing out on. Oxford's a lovely place, and the Bodleian's a seductive environment.
Right.
But I decided to go to library school. And I applied to 2 library schools. The famous one was University College London, and they rejected me. They told me they didn't think I would be able to handle the course. This was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I was accepted at the Sheffield University, which was starting a new school. And I was one of the first intake of the Sheffield University School of Library and Information Science. And there I learnt an attitude. And the attitude is that however things are being done, there's probably a better way.
Mm-hmm.
The people in the school, the 4 faculty, were all new to teaching, and so it was a very benign experience the first year. And they were also very respectful of the people in the trenches, of the working librarians. Nevertheless, there was an attitude that there's probably a better way, and as a professional, it's one's job to try to find it.
So did you develop the attitude, or did you see it in the environment at Sheffield?
Say that again.
So did you was it there in the environment at Sheffield, that attitude of trying to do things better, improving upon things, or was it your personality trait?
I absorbed it at the school, and I think it really came from the director of the school.
Okay.
But I think that was part of the atmosphere of the school. The 4 full-time regular faculty members were all new to teaching, and they were enthusiastic and very positive. And it was a small class of 20 some.
Okay.
And there weren't many electives, so mostly we all took classes together at the same time. and there was a good group.
Right.
Now, I can't remember much about what they taught me, but it was that attitude that stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
So then it was a matter of getting a job. I applied for 2 jobs, and the same thing happened. One university library turned me down, and that was one of the best things that ever happened to me because the other one accepted.
Okay.
You need to understand that in the early 1960s, the British government started a whole bunch of new universities. There were 6 or 7 of them, and they were called the new universities,
Okay.
and mostly in cathedral towns. And one of them was the University of Lancaster, and that was the director of libraries there had this idea that graduates of the new Sheffield Library School were bound to be good. So it was that as much as me that landed me a job as a baby assistant librarian at the University of Lancaster. Now, it should be noted that the creation of these new universities, and they really were new universities, they were not sort of old technical colleges upgraded. They were greenfield sites and brand new university libraries. And this opened up wonderful opportunities for middle rank librarians who would otherwise just be stuck in old libraries waiting for dead men's shoes, as the phrase is. And this had an enormously stimulating effect on academic library work in the UK. And the library that innovated the most and most boldly was Lancaster, largely because of the personality of the person appointed director of libraries, a man called Graham Mackenzie. But it was also part of the ethos of the University of Lancaster, right, which had what Americans would call a land grant ethos. There's no tradition of that in the UK. It's unusual, but that would be a good way of describing the early years of the University of Lancaster. Mm-hmm. So I went to Lancaster, and I got there when the university had been teaching for just 1 year. And we were in a converted furniture factory while a new campus was built.
Right.
And when you start a new university library with very few people, you have to turn your hand to many different things. And so within about 1.5 years, I had done a little bit of almost everything that's done in a university library. And that proved very helpful. If I'd gone to a large library, that wouldn't have been the case. But I did nearly everything: some reference, bibliographical instruction, book selection, cataloging, classification, all kinds of things. Now, Graham Mackenzie, the director, had somehow persuaded the British government that it was one thing to spend a lot of money building new university libraries, but another thing to think about how they should be designed. That a lot of attention had been paid to the history of libraries, and of course a lot was known about the current status of libraries. But what should libraries really be like in 20 years? And paralyzed by the logic of this, the government agreed to give him a grant, a huge grant, for 5 years, with a full professor, principal investigator, and in England a full professor means something. Right. And multidisciplinary staff and so forth. So that was the environment I went into. And unfortunately, fortunately, as it turned out, this grand plan collapsed totally. They had a competition, as you do for architectural enterprises, to find somebody to do it, and they couldn't agree on anybody. And so the whole thing collapsed. Okay. There was an irony in that, because the advisory committee was mainly experienced university librarians, and if they knew what was needed, they wouldn't have needed the project. But anyway, as a consolation prize, the government said to Mackenzie, well, why don't you, as a consolation, we'll give you a little grant for 1 year and play around with that and see what it leads to. Okay. So it was a man and a boy, and I was the boy full-time assigned to undertake what was called a systems analysis of a university library with the part-time help of a statistician. And we had no idea what we were going to do, let alone how we would do it. Mm-hmm. So we started with a very basic question. Libraries are supposed to make books available. Okay, well, how available are the books that people want? As a matter of fact. And this led to another year. It led to an astonishingly rich 5-year program, which involved analyzing the relationship between how long the loan period might be and whether you can renew loans, and whether it should be different for different people, whether it should be different for different books, and when should you buy a spare copy, and what do you know about the pattern of demand? It's certainly not evenly spread across the collection. And if you've got the theory worked out, how can you simulate what changes in any combination of policies would be, and what would happen if you implemented it? Mm-hmm. And mostly I worked with a young academic, Anthony Hindle. Okay. He was killed a year ago in a traffic accident. Okay, but he had a background that was completely different from mine. Mine was the humanities. He had a background partly in industrial psychology and partly in operations research, mathematical modeling. And unlike most people in operations research, he was interested in public services and how they could be improved, mostly healthcare, which is a public service in the UK. And he was interested in library services, and we were about the same age, and we got on very well. And there was an extraordinary chemistry and alignment of interest between Graham Mackenzie, the director of the library, who wanted research done but was not in a position to do it himself. There was Tony Hindle with his astonishingly appropriate methodological skills and very, very sharp, very prudent. And then there was me in the middle as a sort of dog's body and general manager and so forth. It was a very rare combination where we had different personal interests, but we were all aligned in working on this project. And I did that for 5 years. And in Britain, at least at that time, a PhD was entirely dissertation, no coursework, no advancement to candidacy. And I got lucky again because I was able to get a PhD from Sheffield as a byproduct of the work I was being handsomely paid to do at Lancaster. And so my dissertation, which was then published as a book called Book Availability and the Library User, was a very small marginal effort over and above what I was being paid to do. So you can see a lot of fortunate things aligning. And it was because of that work, because of the reputation of that work, that something even more amazing happened. I was offered a job as assistant director of libraries for technical services at a large American research university. Now, I was a young librarian with no supervisory experience, really, not much. Mm-hmm. I'd never worked in the US, didn't have a work permit to work in the US. I really was not the kind of candidate they would normally consider.
And this was 1972?
Yes. It helped that they'd done a wide search and they could only find one candidate they liked in the US, and he turned them down. Yeah. That really helped. So I landed with my wife, my son, my daughter, and my cat in the Midwest in March of 1972 with this senior position at a large research library. And Purdue had a lot of problems, but it had talented staff. And mercifully, it had a new director of libraries who knew that everything needed spring cleaning and overhauling.
Mm-hmm.
So my primary task was to modernize technical services, which was acquisitions and cataloging and library automation program. But in addition, they did a very large internal management self-study. And for that, you really need the proverbial man from Mars or woman from Mars, who's neutral and independent to chair it. They didn't have anybody from Mars, but they had me newly arrived from England. Right. So I was designated to lead that effort, which I did. And I also got involved in the development of a statewide multi-type, different kinds of libraries, a library consortium. And I was repeatedly vice president, president-elect, but I never actually got to be president because I left the state. And that was the first, that involved the first use of OCLC library services outside of Ohio. I learned a lot. I had learned a lot at Lancaster about planning and design and measurement. At Purdue, I learned a lot about the human, the people side of life and library work and library management. And then I got a phone call, would I be interested in being Dean of the University of California, Berkeley Library School? And I didn't even know there was a vacancy, and I didn't have any such plans. So I had thought once in a while that modernizing a library school might be an interesting challenge, but I was very happy as a Hoosier in Indiana. But they said they offered me a free trip to San Francisco for me and my wife. I knew there was a catch. There was. I had to give a talk. And again, the circumstances were propitious. The school was in a very unhappy state with deep problems. And they knew they needed, and they had to find a new dean, and they wanted somebody with actual library experience. They wanted somebody who had a PhD, which I'd done not because I needed a PhD, but it's like a visa and a passport.
Right.
To go some places you need a visa, and so if you've got it, that's sort of handy. And if it's not too much extra effort, it's a good idea to sort of pick it up on the way through, which is what I did. So they wanted somebody with some library background, and there'd been a lot of strife inside amongst the faculty, and relationships with the alumni needed improvement. And they wanted somebody with a PhD. And there were 4 finalists, and the other finalists either withdrew or said foolish things that led them to be excluded from consideration. So rather like a demolition derby, I was the last man standing, last person standing. And I thought, why not? You know, this is an interesting opportunity. So with my wife and my son and my daughter and the same cat, we moved further west to California. I arrived in January 1976. I was then 34 years old. I was the youngest member of the faculty. And it was hard. I mean, this was the first time I'd worked in an academic department rather than the library. I'd never taught a course before. But I saw myself more as a hired gun. I was there to manage, to change. The school had been examined closely by the campus a few years before. This is the practice in the University of California. It's a little bit like accreditation, only it's much more serious. And a group had decided that preparing good librarians was a very good thing. But there were other schools doing that.
Right.
And there was all kinds of problems outside of libraries that were library-like, having to do with the marking and parking of documents and data that were not getting attention. And if you're in a big snooty research university, you shouldn't define yourself in terms of one institution, but with a body of knowledge, competence, and skills. And so it was agreed by everybody that it should evolve from a library school to a school of information something.
Mm-hmm.
They all agreed on that, but they had no idea quite what that would be, let alone what it would be called. And they were really vague as to what it would teach and how it would proceed. So there was a mandate to do this. And I was recruited really to make that happen. And so that was my task. That was what I set out to do. And the first thing was to try to reduce the level of conflict. And fortunately, by the time I got there, the faculty were willing to bury the hatchet, and they knew that they needed to work together. And I feel very good about the years that followed, as we gradually tried to do this without alienating the alumni, and we did it. And mainly we did it by absolutely refusing to distinguish librarianship from information science. There's no intellectually honest way to separate the two. Then after 7 years, the University of California system-wide administration had a problem. You have to understand, it's a really big system. Right. There were then 9 campuses, including UCLA and Berkeley and other large ones. And the state had mandated that the university develop a library plan. This had been done in the late 70s. And they hired somebody to get it implemented. All he had to do was devise a single, coherent, economical plan and get buy-in from faculty, university administrators, campuses, the academic senate, in theory, students, the State Department of Finance, the state administration, the legislature, and so on.
And that's as hard as it can get.
His name was Steve Salmon, and he did it, and a plan was adopted. But then in the summer of 1983, he went sailing in the Caribbean with his wife and announced he wasn't coming back. And he wasn't going to resign either, because there'd been allegations made about him and there was an audit going on, and he wasn't going to resign until he'd been cleared. Now, there were huge problems of every kind. The librarians were the first who decided to unionize amongst academic employees. A huge storage warehouse for books was being built, and everything was going wrong with the building. A wildly ambitious automation program for a union catalog was stalled. They didn't have the telecommunications to support it if it had worked, and they couldn't get the software to work. I mean, they just went on and on and on. And so they decided that they really needed somebody to fill in. And they needed somebody familiar with the University of California. They wanted somebody with a background in academic libraries. And they wanted somebody with administrative experience. And they didn't want anybody who currently worked for one of the campus libraries, because that might cause jealousy.
Okay.
And who could start at 10 days' notice. So, you know, like a Boolean and, I was really the only convenient person around. So I agreed to do that temporarily. And then I stayed on as assistant vice president for library plans and policies, juggling all these problems and running interference so that things could be done. And after the first year, I gave up the deanship and concentrated on full-time. It was fascinating, and it was really, really, really difficult. And I learned a lot from it. The ruthlessness of fights over resources and policies, both with some of the campuses who didn't want to know about the central administration and saw that the logic of economics and technology was diminishing the role of the independence of campuses. And other units within the system-wide administration was ruthless in a way I could never have believed until I encountered it. And that was a very stressful, if challenging, time. And in the end, it became untenable. So I left and I started a whole new career as an irresponsible professor. I'd never been that before. I went back to the school as just a professor with no administrative responsibilities. And the benefit of that was, for the first time, I could study what I wanted to do. I could work on what I wanted, and I was not having to follow an institutional imperative as I had at Lancaster and Purdue and at the system-wide administration. And there were two things that I was really interested in. I knew that more sophisticated search support could be developed, making online catalogs better. It was on my watch that the Melville system, which was a path-breaking second-generation online catalog, was developed by people who reported to me. But there was more that could have been done and should have been done, but there wasn't political support for it. And so I had some ideas as to what could be done, but I totally lacked the technical skills to do it. So this meant I had to get grants to pay people to do the technical stuff. And I worked with my late colleague, Ray Larson. He had good ideas about probabilistic search mechanisms, and classification clustering was it was early recommender systems. And so with him, and later with Fred Guy, for nearly 20 years, we kept an evolving research program with several millions of dollars of grants. I was totally dependent on those two and on talented doctoral students. My role was a sort of general manager and supporter and principal investigator and writer of reports, proposals and reports. That was one. And then the second was, I became increasingly interested in the intellectual history of library and information science. And this was partly because I'd had an epiphany in a natural history museum. In between my school office and my office of the President's System-Wide Administration office, as I walked between them, was a huge building known as the Life Sciences Building. And on the side of the building, there was a little door with a little plaque which said Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. The door was always closed. One day, I noticed a little piece of paper was on the door. So I went over and read it, and it said they were going to have an open house on a forthcoming Saturday. This, they said, was the first open house in 75 years. So I thought I'd better go. I mean, another 75 years, I might not be interested any longer. I couldn't persuade any member of my family to go with me, so I went. And I saw these revolting things in nasty liquids in glass jars, and skeletons, and a chilled room full of the pelts of strange animals. But what really got my attention was a cabinet with shallow drawers, like you have for maps.
Right.
I opened one, and it was full of dead woodpeckers and dead sapsuckers. Now, this is in the middle of the campus, and I thought this is absurd. The one thing that's scarcer than money at Berkeley is space.
Right.
And you use central campus space for trays of dead birds. I mean, this is nonsense. But a wise old man had once said to me, Michael, you just don't understand, which I've heard so many times. If somebody appears to be acting irrationally, the odds are there is a rationale, it's just that you don't know what it is.
Right.
This has saved me a number of times. So I stood and gazed at these dead woodpeckers and sapsuckers, and I said, what could possibly be the rationale? And all of a sudden it dawned on me, this is a university concerned with learning. There's researchers discovering things that they didn't know were already known, or maybe weren't already known. And you have students learning what they should learn. And as a librarian, I get involved in this with the books on the shelves. This is a dead bird library. It's a non-lending library. These birds are no different. They're things you inspect and learn from.
Right.
And the dead bird's a good compromise between a photograph of a bird and a live bird in terms of convenience and trade-offs. So to anybody who wouldn't run away fast enough, I would give a lecture on dead birds as documents. Well, fortunately for the inhabitants of Berkeley, I was coming up to entitlement sabbatical, and I was going to leave Berkeley. And I went to the University.
So this is a dead tree then, from that point of view, right?
So I went to Australia. I went around the world, first to Australia, and then Austria. And in Australia, in Sydney, I was a visiting guest at the School of Library Information and Archives at the University of New South Wales. So it's in a suburb of Sydney. And as soon as I got there, I went to see Boyd Raywood, the head of department, an old friend, and immediately started lecturing him on dead birds as documents. And he said, stop. And he handed me a piece of paper, which was my idea, but it was written in French and it was 40 years old. And that's how I came to know of Suzanne Brier's notion of an antelope as a document. So when I wrote it up, as a gentleman, I gave her credit for priority and wrote about antelopes as documents. But it was basically my dead bird idea that had been had, like most of my ideas, by somebody else earlier on. But this piqued my interest in the history of the field, and especially in work in continental Europe before 1945. And that's quite symbolic, because in the mythical received history of information science, everything begins in New England in 1945. It's total nonsense, but that's the received opinion. And I became more and more, so when I got back, I read up on the work of Suzanne Brier and wrote about her. And that led me to Paul Otlet and his big manifesto of 1934. And I felt like an archaeologist who discovered the traces of a lost civilization overgrown in the jungle. And I became more and more intolerant of the received history, in particular, the nonsense of Vannevar Bush as the father of information science. So 1945 was a very symbolic time. And one day it was the last straw when I saw a silly adulatory remark about Bush. And I said, I'm a librarian, I'm going to find out the rest of the story. And I shuffled over to the library not knowing what I would do, but I was going to do it. The only clue I had was that I remembered vaguely that an Englishman, Robert Fairthorne, who worked both before and after the Second World War in documentation, had written an essay critical of Bush. And so I found the essay, and it had it was about the essay As We May Think. He said, Bush doesn't know what he's talking about. He forgets his own assumptions. There's nothing original at all in this. And it's a reflection on a souped-up desktop microfilm reader. That fact is often overlooked in discussion of the essay. And there's a single sentence saying that a similar machine appears to have been developed by a Dr. E. Goldberg of the Zeiss Company around 1930. Now, that single sentence was electrifying, and I'd never heard of a Goldberg. I'd never heard of any such thing. And I spent 15 years on and off digging up the forgotten story of Emanuel Goldberg and his electronic search engine, which he developed in the late 20s. It was a wonderful experience. But I digress. But that explains a lot of what I've written and what I've done. After some 16 years as a mere professor, I retired. And that didn't change very much. It meant that I didn't have to give classes. But Berkeley treats its emeriti very well, and I've been able to continue puttering with the things that interest me ever since, and I hope to continue to do so. The one thing I've continued to do is that a former colleague at the system-wide administration, Clifford Lynch, now the executive director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and I developed a seminar. It's really more of a weekly colloquium, and we've co-chaired that now for more than 30 years, and it's still going.
So every week you do it?
Pardon?
You do it every week?
Yes, yes. It's mostly Zoom now, and everybody is welcome to join in.
Oh, that's for 30 years you've done it every week. That's amazing.
Yes. Well, some people don't know when to quit. Anyway, so that's really the story of my life. But you asked about serendipity, and I have to say that it's been a very interesting life, and I'm content with it. But it's been based on a series of accidents, each one leading to another. If the University College London, if I'd stayed on at the Bodleian, none of this would have happened. If I'd been accepted by University College London Library School, none of this would have happened. If I hadn't been hired at Lancaster, it certainly wouldn't have happened. And if Purdue hadn't done the extraordinary thing of importing a young, ill-prepared Englishman for a senior position, I wouldn't have come to the States. If I'd not been able to get a PhD on the side, as I did at Lancaster, none of this would have happened. So,
and if you hadn't seen the ad about the open house in the Museum of Natural History, then you may not have had the epiphany about dead birds here as documents.
As Dean, I've always been interested in how things are related to each other. And after I'd been Dean for 4 years, I had a short sabbatical. And I went to stay in the Austrian Alps, where there was nobody to talk to and nothing I could read. And that was ideal. I didn't do the work I planned to do, which was some leftover work from Lancaster. Instead, I was bothered, really bothered by two aspects of the school. The faculty didn't seem very interested in each other's work. And somehow I felt they ought to be.
Right.
And the other was, we were all agreed that the school should diversify its product. It should be concerned with library-like environments outside of libraries as well as in. We were interested in records management and would have been interested in archives if we thought the archival profession was ready at that time.
Right.
Databases of various kinds. And we didn't get into museum documentation, but we could have. We all felt good about this, but it would be an exaggeration to say we'd thought through a rationale for it, and I felt there ought to be one. So there were two problems. One, they weren't interested in each other's work, and the other was we didn't seem to have a coherent theory of what a school of information should be, and I
Right.
thought we should. So in 1981, I spent a few months in the Austrian Alps. I decided that these two different problems were the same problem, that they had to be related to each other. So me and Einstein liked to do the special theory before the general theory. And the special theory was to start with libraries, library services. The task was consider library services. How is each part related to each other part? And how are they all related to the context? That was the simple question. And so I sort of wrote out of the top of my head everything I could think or remember on this. And that was published as Library Services in Theory and Context. But it was always intended to be the first step towards a broader treatment that would deal with the marking and parking, collection-based information services of all kinds.
Right.
That had to wait for another sabbatical, which I worked on that in Australia and then Austria in 1981, and then late 1980s, and that was published as Information and Information Systems. So most of my writing, I would say, has to do with trying to figure out how things are related to each other.
Right, and I see some kind of classification as well, and trying to, like even in your paper on information as thing, right? Where you classify information as thing, as process, and like you're trying to put it.
That's right. It needed sorting out. That's what it needed, and there's still more to be done. Now, you asked me what I think information science is, and I've given you a partial answer. The fact is that there's two areas that are named information science, and there's very little overlap between them. One is what I would call formal information science, or the physics of information. This has to do with entropy, Shannon's information theory, encryption, and all kinds of technical mathematical stuff and probability. And that's a lively, important area. But it has next to nothing to do with what's often referred to as library and information science, which is concerned with what do people know. It matters what people know. Ignorance is dangerous, both for individuals and society. There are exceptions having to do with privacy and security, but on the whole, it's a bad idea to be ignorant and to deal with ignorant people. I mean, do you want a doctor who doesn't know what he's doing? Or a lawyer who doesn't know the law? Or a car mechanic who doesn't understand your vehicle? It just goes on and on. It matters. It matters to the individual what's going on and what the options are, and it matters to society. And lots of people get involved in this, the media, education, and so on. But I would say that that's the central purpose of library and information science. It's the only field that deals with this frontally. And any issue that's seriously important in society is going to be complicated. There's going to be legal, ethical, economic, political, technical, all kinds of different aspects that you can't ignore. Now, I was involved in a review of an education school once, and it was really sad. You'd think a school of education would be one of the most exciting places on campus, because it's how do people get to know what they know? No way. They were only interested in schools and the management of schools. And we pointed this out to them, and they just got defensive. It was really sad. it was too narrow. And the reason why a library school, a school of library and information science, call it what you will, it matters, is because ignorance and knowledge in society matters. It's a grave mistake to worry about whether you're a discipline or not.
Right.
It's much more important to occupy the high ground. If you're concerned with a seriously important social matter, then that's what's going to preserve you, not any claim to being a discipline.
So you think an LIS school or an LIS program or a profession helps uncover the complexities of human life or reality, or by trying to uncover answers to questions for people who are searching for them?
I'll put it this way. It matters both to the individuals and society what people know. And therefore, helping people, doing what you can to enable people to know what they need to know. That's really, really important.
And to remove ignorance, as you said.
To me, that's the justification for schools of LIS. They all have to choose some area within it. You can't cover, none of them are big enough to cover the whole field. And specializing in libraries or maybe picking up archives as well is a perfectly valid way to go, but you really need to see it in its broader context. So that's my sense of what information science is. I like to use the word documentation, but that's rather old-fashioned and
right.
It's not considered very elegant.
And removing ignorance, right? Because you said ignorance is not helpful. So libraries or LIS programs help people know, so help people become less ignorant.
Yes. Why else do you have libraries?
Right.
Now, you asked me who influenced me, and I guess there's a sense of, did I have any mentors? And the answer is that lots and lots of people have influenced me, and nearly everybody I've worked with has influenced me. But I don't really identify anybody as a mentor in the traditional sense. My parents and my home environment, I'll come back to that later, really shaped me as the kind of person I am. In terms of work, the one person I think I learned most from was Tony Hindle, and his background in psychology and mathematical models and efficiency. That was completely outside my humanities background. And then after that, I would identify Patrick Wilson, my late colleague at Berkeley, a man of prodigious knowledge and an extraordinarily penetrating mind. He was a good friend. He was very helpful, quite ruthless in his criticism, but always helpful. And there was another one, Ray Swank, who was somewhat similar to Wilson. But I think Wilson actually influenced me more. The other thing in thinking about this is doctoral students. The best thing, for me, the best thing in the world about being a professor is being able to engage with doctoral students in developing their research projects. It's lovely. You get to plan the work and they get to do it for you.
Right.
But the Berkeley School, as long as I was active in it, expected students to really think up original dissertation topics. If they couldn't think of a proper topic, they weren't fit to be a doctoral student. That's a sort of humanities background. And we tried to make them both intellectually interesting and practically useful where possible. And I worked closely with a whole series of students and a few students from other universities too. And that was really a learning experience for me in many ways. So I have to put a shout out for them.
Any books that influenced you?
Ah, yes, there was one. It was so bad, it provoked me, it inspired me to write better. It was a book about, let's see, Alvin Schrader and somebody else. And it was a tirade about the failure of library science because it wasn't a science.
Mm.
This was, I don't know, about 1980. And I was given it to review. Mel
Okay.
Voigt, the editor of Library and Information Science Research, gave it to me to review. And I thought it was absolutely wrong in many ways. And that was a great inspiration. So a bad book influenced me more than any particular good book.
Right. And
Uh,
any incidents in your life? I know you recounted various incidents which had serendipity as a part of it. And
Well, the dead birds stands out as a particular incident. The experience at Lancaster, the satisfaction of being assigned a problem, being able to figure out what's related to what, being able to collect data and develop models that could predict what changes would be, figuring out a really cost-effective solution, seeing it implemented, and seeing a dramatic consequence.
right.
That was a slow motion thing. But the situation is that it was a very good, very well designed library. But people complained they couldn't find the books they were looking for. And this upset Graham Mackenzie, the director of the library. That wasn't the way it was supposed to be. He'd invested in excellent staff. He'd spent a lot of money. The selection was done carefully. So this was what we were told to find a solution to.
Right.
And we discovered that when people came to the library looking for a book, they could find what they wanted about 6 times out of 10. We later discovered that this is typical of libraries because demand adjusts to the supply. There's a homeostatic balance that goes on. We didn't know that then.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you get from 60% availability? You can't get to 100%, but 80. Scientifically divide it by 2 to get a number, 80. What would it take to get to 80% immediate availability on the shelves? And the answer was either you take all of the next year's book fund and spend it on duplicate copies,
Right.
or you have variable loan policies where the length of loan depends on how popular the book is, regardless of who's borrowing it.
Mm-hmm.
So if 9% of the most popular books were limited to 1 week loan, renewals allowed, that would have the same impact on availability as blowing the whole next year's book budget on duplicates.
Right.
Well, naturally, the library committee opted for the second. And there was a dramatic increase. And in fact, it did go to 8 times out of 10. But demand responded to a better service. And a year later, guess what? People were finding what they wanted on the shelf 6 times out of 10, but the library was a lot busier.
Right.
So it was done again. And it went to 8 times out of 10. But by the end of another year, it was 6 times out of 10, but usage of the library had doubled over the 2-year period.
Mm-hmm.
It was like discovering you're in a large, huge piece of equipment that's moving. And so that's what the work at Lancaster was about. That's what was written up as my doctoral dissertation, and that's on the book.
And I taught a course at Simmons for many years called Evaluation of Evaluation of Information Services, which is pretty much about evaluating library services of all kinds. And that's what you have done practically in your career, basically.
Yes. Yes. The other person who influenced my career was Graham Mackenzie. If he had not hired me to work at Lancaster, and if he had not insisted on there being an unprecedented library research project in the library, I mean, there was absolutely no precedent for that in the UK. And I think my dissertation was probably the first PhD ever in Britain on how to run libraries good.
Right.
It was really, really radical. So he influenced my career totally, because everything followed from that. If I hadn't got a PhD, I wouldn't be at Berkeley. If I hadn't got involved in the research, I would not have been hired at Purdue. If I hadn't done that work and it hadn't worked out well, I would still be a librarian in the north of England, a retired one, presumably now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you ask about key skills.
Yeah, some key skills you developed that have helped you over the years.
Well, very influential has been my lack of skill. I gave up math before calculus, and I really don't know much about computing. I really don't find these things interesting. Now, what can be done with mathematics and statistics and computers, that's very interesting.
Right.
But how it's done, I just don't find. People are interesting. I just don't find math or computing technology interesting. That's forced me to collaborate because I've been fortunate in being able to get people to do technical work that I couldn't. On my own, it reverts to management and foundations and history.
Right.
So
being able to work with people, collaborate, right, is a key skill. To collaborate.
What many people going into librarianship don't understand is you can't be a librarian unless you're working with people. I don't mean the users, I mean other librarians. You can't be a professional without sitting on committees.
Right.
Chairing a committee is a very important art. You're going to have a boss. You have to manage your boss. You have people reporting to you.
Right.
You deal with people who maybe not doing what they should be. You may have problems of discipline. You can't be a professional librarian without dealing with people. I mean, you can't hide. You might be able to become a rare book librarian in an isolated situation, but it's unlikely. You deal with people if you're a professional. Yes, you have to. I mean, you have to in life too. Yeah. You asked about my biggest successes. I'm tempted to say that my biggest success is survival, in the sense that at Lancaster, I was charged to go do something when we had no idea what it was we were going to do. And Purdue had terrible problems in the library. I was advised by a knowledgeable person not to touch the Purdue job because it was such a mess.
Right.
What they didn't know is it was just the time to go in. And that is when you've got a mess, but people inside understand there's a mess and something should be done about it. It was in fact, contrary to the advice, the ideal time to go in. And there was a new director and a new university president. Otherwise, it would have been a mistake.
Yes, I think, and this is key advice too, in the sense that when things are working well, there isn't much for you to do. When things are not working well, it makes you useful.
There you go. There you go. And the Berkeley Library School had severe problems. Now, the faculty had decided in theory that they were going to become a new kind of school.
Right.
And they decided personally that it was time to stop fighting. These are really important signs, but it only takes you so far. And the system-wide library problems at the University of California, they were really hard problems. And so I spent all these years, but I saw myself if not as a hired gun, at least as I was charged to make things happen or to induce change or to facilitate change. That's the things that were so that's the sort of negative claim to fame.
Right.
You referred to my article, Information as Thing, and that's by far my most cited thing. That's what I'm remembered for, Me and the Antelope, although it was Suzanne Brier's Antelope.
Right.
But I would suggest that there are two things that I regard as unusual and successful. One was this whole body of work about book availability that I did. It was joint work with Tony Hindle, but it was theory, methodology, practice, implementation, and it was really a remarkable experience. The other is that in poking around the forgotten world of early 20th century pioneers and despising the half-baked notions of the role of Vannevar Bush, I had decided to look at the rest of the story, and I came across this single sentence that Dr. E. Goldberg of the Zeiss Company in Dresden had apparently developed such a machine. And I spent 15 years chasing that down. I got to discover his son, his daughter. I tracked down people who'd worked with Goldberg. Almost none of the evidence was in English. It had required me to dig into the university systems of Tsarist Russia, the German Empire, the First World War, the Weimar Republic in Germany and its problems, the rise of the Nazis. He was a victim of he was kidnapped by Nazi thugs when he was the head of the largest firm in town, one of the largest companies in the equivalent of Microsoft.
Right.
Zeiss was the world's largest camera and equipment firm, and he was kidnapped. And I got to meet a guy who was there 60 years before. Goldberg was head of Zeiss, this huge camera firm. It was made of a merger, and he was the managing director. And the local Nazis were stirring up trouble, and he lingered in his office after work and to chat with his senior managers. And he was an inventor, a designer. And because he was the big CEO, he had a lab attached to his office. So if he had an attack of inventiveness, he would just go next door where there was a junior engineer and they'd work on something.
Right.
And sometime after 5 p.m., there was a noise in the corridor outside his office, and in came some Nazi thugs with truncheons and guns. They were going to kidnap him. He wasn't in his office, he was in one of his staff's office, and they arrested him and took him away. They took him to a pub initially and insulted him, and then they took him out into the forest, tied him to a tree, and discussed how they were going to kill him. Now, in the lab next door was a very junior engineer who heard this, so he hid in the darkroom and shut the door behind him and turned the light off. So he heard it, and he was there, and he was told afterwards by some of the thugs, "Well, it was a good job you weren't there, otherwise we'd have taken you too."
Mm-hmm.
I got to meet him. Anyway, it's a very long and interesting story, and I think there was a guiding light that was helping me discover some of these things. But that, I'm very proud. I got enormous pleasure out of working on the Goldberg biography, and I learned a lot. It required everything I'd learned, my self-taught German and some French, and my history of Central Europe, and all kinds of things.
So which phases of your life made you resilient? What were the hardest and challenging times that required to be your strongest and not break down under pressure? And did these phases affect your life purpose in some way?
Well, resilience, this is an interesting question, and I've thought about it a bit. And I think the answer has to be that to the extent I'm resilient, it stems from my childhood. My parents were religious, but in particularly, they were very strong on moral principles. You could think of it as the Protestant ethic. One is expected to make the world a better place.
Right.
And that's a given. And that motives, one's motives for doing things need to be thought about. And honesty is important. And consideration for other people is important. Now, in a career, there's also legal aspects. And in personnel matters, the law matters. When I was dean, we often had arguments about who to hire. And I would say to the faculty, if our decision is challenged, I'm the one that'll have to defend it in court. And I'm not going to agree to anything that I don't feel that I can defend in court if I needed to. And so I think that if you feel you're on strong moral grounds, and if you feel you're on strong legal grounds, that helps one to be resilient. Another thing is that I learned from Tony Hindle. It's a great mistake to allow yourself to be intimidated because it leads to further intimidation. And as one of my friends on the Berkeley campus like to say, saying no to somebody gets a lot easier after the first time.
Right.
Now, you put all that together, the importance of, if you feel you're doing the morally right thing, and if you feel you're doing the legally right thing, and if you're allergic to being intimidated, and if you know that saying no to somebody fierce gets easier after the first time, these are the considerations that lead one to be resilient, I think. Or
Yes,
at least I think they've helped me.
and I think when someone says when you say no to someone, right, and the person and you talked about like there could be a circumstance where you might feel intimidated and you're refusing to, right?
Yes.
And it's hard because the bigger the power that you're saying no to or standing up to, right? Or the bigger the cost of your saying no to in some ways, the
Well,
more.
what goes with this is a belief that expedient solutions are generally not expedient in the long term. A quick fix may be satisfactory depending on what it is. But if there are moral or legal or other consequences, and expedient solutions are often very problematic in the long-term consequences. And if you put all that together, that sort of builds one's resolve to be resilient.
Right.
Now, you asked me about hard times. The hardest time I had was certainly when I was Assistant Vice President for Library Plans and Policies, dealing with strong-minded campus library directors on campuses that didn't wish to know there was a system-wide administration. They wanted to be autonomous.
Right.
And worse, other parts in the central administration, there was a particular tension over telecommunications. Who was responsible and who pays and how? That was the hardest, I would say. But it wasn't the most distressing. The most distressing was in the early 90s when the Berkeley campus administration had made a sustained effort to close the school. Now, this was pointless and stupid at every level. There was no reason for it, or the reasons given were silly. In the end, it failed. But the school was renamed. It was given a new mission. Basically what we'd been trying to do but hadn't been allowed to do. And it became a campus priority. But there was a face-saving legal fiction that the old school had been closed and a new one started that lingered on, and that's what everybody got to believe. The whole thing was an appalling mistake, and the price, psychological and otherwise, that many people paid was very high. That was the sort of most distressing part of my career.
Right.
Now, you asked what would have been different if I'd known it earlier.
Yeah, what is something you wish you knew earlier in your life? Yeah.
I thought about that, and I really don't have an answer. I mean, you can't know everything instantly when you're young. You have to learn as you go along. And I've not been able to think of anything very specific. I mean, anything I've learned could have been useful if I'd learned it earlier, obviously.
Right.
But I've not been able to think of anything specific that would have changed my life if I'd known it earlier. And you ask about life principles.
Yeah, life principles or values that you follow.
Yes, I do have one unusual one.
Which one?
It's a theory about reincarnation. You see, I actually think that when you die, and that's the end of it. But there is the possibility of reincarnation. Now, what's important about this is this. As long as there's any doubt about reincarnation, you'd better have fun the first time around in case there isn't a second time. And the older I get, the more strongly I subscribe to that principle.
That in case there's no incarnation, you better have fun the first time.
Yeah, you better make the most of the life you've got, just in case you don't get another one.
Right.
People should pay more attention to that.
And even if you get another one, you do not know, because that time you do not have the memory of the previous one a lot of the times. Right. So
I don't have any memory of a previous one.
of a previous one. So in that case, you better have fun in any case, even if there is a reincarnation or not.
It's a can't lose strategy.
Yeah, it's a can't lose strategy. Yeah.
That's right, because if you make the most of your present life and you get another one, then you're fortunate.
Yeah, then you're fortunate.
And if you make the most of this life and there isn't another one, well, it's just as well you made the most of it.
Right. Yeah, and you better make use of the next one too if you do get one. What are your life lessons?
Well, that's one of my lessons. As to what I'm going to do, what are my goals now? I would say more of the same. There's an enormous amount of work that needs doing. I've got an article pending on context that I'll send you if it's accepted.
Yes, yeah, I wanted to ask you this. So I know that you have a copy of my book, right?
Yes.
On exploring context and information behavior. And when I saw you in Salt Lake City at the ACEST annual meeting, you told me that some of the work that you're doing now is on context and following up on some aspects of this book. So do you want to elaborate on that work?
You'll have to wait, but absolutely, yes. For example, I learned yesterday that a paper has been accepted in JASIS on copy theory. What's interesting about a copy? Why do we make copies? What's the consequence of a copy? What is a copy? Why does it matter? It's a long, complex article.
Congratulations.
All I know, it's the first paper on the topic.
Yeah, I haven't seen a paper on this topic before that.
Well, you see, there's a lot of work to be done in these basic issues like copies and relevance and context and so on. And of course, on the intellectual history. So there's lots of work to be done. And my goal is to see how much more I can do before I become completely senile.
Yeah, and do you? No, you will not be. That you're very active and very sharp.
Yeah, but how long will it last?
it will be. It will last for a long time. At least I'm confident. When you do you want to you told me that there were two projects that you were working on to do with context, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Do you want to talk briefly about at least a broad stroke of
Uh,
it?
I'll leave that to tantalize you for later.
Okay,
Uh,
no, from the audience perspective, for somebody who's watching this, just to see the it kinds of
well,
projects you're
I will
working.
simply say that it's clear from your book, which was very helpful, I might say,
Thank you.
that the theorizing about context is a mess.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of different ideas, but they're not really very coherent, and they need sorting out and the implications working through and so on. And that's what I've been trying to work on with Wayne DeFremery, who's a professor, an American working in Korea. And another one is relevance. Relevance is symbolic for me for what's wrong with information science. And in two ways. Years ago, well, from the time that people started doing retrieval evaluation and the Cranfield experiments in particular, it was noticed that you could either get greater purity, precision, or you could get greater completeness, recall. But there was a tendency, if you emphasized one, you'd get less of the other.
Right.
So for decades, this was occasionally noted. No contrary examples were ever found. And yet, although information retrieval was supposedly one of the most scientific parts of information science, nobody seemed interested in why this was the case or how it came to be. And in the seminar that I co-chaired with Clifford Lynch some years ago, in the 90s, I took this up, and in class we worked it through and eventually published a paper in JASIS, which I believe I discovered that some specialists did understand it all. Steve Robertson did. But I think this was the first working through of why such a trade-off is entailed. It's unavoidable in the way that people approach relevance. And it seemed to me rather symbolic that all these people want to call themselves scientists, and they hadn't addressed this central paradox. And more recently, the whole notion of relevance deserves more attention. I mean, everybody agrees it's central. Everybody agrees that it's really confusing. You can have it's used in information retrieval system evaluation.
Right.
Using a series of assumptions, every one of which is known to be incorrect. Namely, that relevance is binary, something is relevant or it's not, simple. That the relevance of documents are independent of each other, which is obviously not. That you can predict what will be relevance for somebody else, which is obviously not, or at least not reliably. And so the whole core literature on information retrieval is based on assumptions that everybody knows are untenable. I mean, what kind of science is that? It's not good enough. So that's another candidate that, like a piñata, I hope to take a good whack at. There's just an awful lot of work that needs to be done. So this leads me to my advice. You see, I have two favorite things. One is talking about myself, and the other is giving other people advice.
Yeah, what mentoring advice do you have of people who might follow in your footsteps?
Today I get to do both.
Yeah.
So it's my lucky day.
My lucky day too.
So my advice, I've got 5 points. One is, I think it's, if I was giving advice to a baby beginner in library and information science, especially one who wants to be an academic,
Right.
try to work on problems that are important. They may be difficult and they may not be soluble, and you need to get stuff done before you go up for tenure and all that. But other things being equal, concentrate on problems that matter. It's much more worthwhile. Most of what's published is routine and trivial. It's pick out problems that matter. It's much better use of your life and energies. Secondly, and this is particularly true of dissertation work, pick a topic you find interesting rather than what's fashionable. I mean, if you can get both, that's nice. But if it's not interesting, you'll have difficulty staying with it or getting engaged with it. So it's important to pursue what you personally find interesting.
Right.
You're more likely to get there. Then the third piece of advice is whatever you do, document it. Make sure there's a record of it somewhere. It doesn't have to be a fancy paper in an expensive journal, but make sure there's some note, some evidence, some place. So what you've done is recorded and knowable, either because it's a good idea, which it should be if you've done something, worked on something important, and also at evidence that you've not been wasting your time. So there's two quite different reasons why, if you do anything, it's a good idea to document it. And fourthly, not everybody seizes opportunities when they come along. I felt this rather personally as a young librarian, where I was reassigned happily from being a useful librarian doing good stuff to working on a research project. But other people of my vintage and age at that time wouldn't have done that. They might decide that they would do a master's degree in some other subject. They think that would be good for their careers. I thought that was extremely sad, that you ignore problems in your own field and divert your energies to some other field. It just made me very sad. But that's what people did. They wanted to do what they thought was safe and respectable,
Right.
rather than risk an opportunity. And then finally, it helps to be born lucky, like me.
Yeah, so I think when we were talking before the interview, I was telling you that you call yourself born lucky, but I think it's also because you see life in a very positive way, and you see hardships as opportunities, and or even when you get opportunities, you make use of them, and you tend to take them on. So I think there is some lesson there.
Well, as I said, some people would not have wanted to be reassigned to full-time research, to do things you had no idea what it would involve. I was explicitly advised not to go to Purdue because it was a mess.
Right.
But who else is going to offer me a job in the United States? I mean, I figured out that Purdue is in West Lafayette, Indiana, southeast of Chicago. And I figured out I could get back to Manchester, England in 13 hours in an emergency. So, and I also figured that if my experience at Purdue was a total disaster, professionally in every other way, if I went back to the States, mere fact it was on my curriculum vitae, my resume, would be a real asset. So it was a totally no risk undertaking. It was sad that I was leaving Tony Hindle and Graham Mackenzie and this wonderful environment at Lancaster And in fact, after I left, the chemistry disappeared and the research program fizzled out. That was the downside. That and taking children away from their grandparents on both sides. But professionally, accepting this wild offer from Purdue struck me as no risk.
Right.
So be born lucky and be willing to occasionally follow an opportunity. Otherwise, I'm going to get all pompous now.
So Michael, how old are you now? Are you 80 years old?
I'm 80 years old. I marvel at the fact that it's actually happened that I've got to be 80.
Yeah, so you're born in 1942, I think, right?
41.
41, okay. 1941. And so what, and you retired as a professor in 2004, right? Which is almost 18 years. And you have been active post-retirement, like you were active all your life, and you have been active post-retirement in research and writing and a lot of things that you're doing. So I think there is a great value to somebody listening to this or watching this right now to understanding what keeps you going and like how do you get this energy and the motivation to keep doing all the work that you continue to do?
Well, I felt psychologically it was time to retire. The school was finally on a healthy footing. It took many years, but it was finally. We had a very wise dean, Annalise Saxenian.
Right.
She was dean for 15 years. It took most of that time to get the school really, really healthy and expanding and on a good footing and very successful. And because I personally identified with the school deeply, psychologically. I felt it was time to move on, and I'd been in. I started at the Bodleian in 1963. So, and my retirement was effective at the end of December 2003. So that was a respectable period, and I knew that I could. I didn't go to library school in order to be a teacher. I went to the library school because there was a management challenge to modernize a desperately needed rethinking and developing of an important institution, the library school. That's why I went. It wasn't because I was eager to be a teacher. And I knew that if I simply gave up, if I became emeritus, I could then concentrate on what I enjoyed doing, and that's reading and some writing and puttering, as I say. I do the occasional jigsaw puzzle and crosswords, but I realized very early on, as I could have predicted, I was not ready for a rocking chair.
Right.
I don't like to be bored. So I do what I enjoy doing. As Emanuel Goldberg said, if you enjoy doing it, it's not work.
Yes.
I can't imagine what else I would do. I mean, if I went blind and couldn't read, that really would be a problem. And Berkeley has fabulous library collections. I got a grant recently for a joint project with a man in Bordeaux, France, work on another forgotten pioneer, Robert Pagès. And Berkeley has the collections that will support this kind of work, French publications of the 1940s and 50s. It's amazing. Anyway, and the campus treats emeriti professors very well. I maintained a share of an office for a very long time. I get wonderful IT support from the school,
right.
And minimal office support. So it's not really like retirement. It's just not having teaching assignments.
Right. No.
I miss I couldn't stop my doctoral students graduating, and I miss not having doctoral students. I've had a couple from Brazil who've come and adopted me for a while, but otherwise, being a professor at Berkeley is a privileged existence, and being an emeritus professor at Berkeley is a privileged existence, and I know it, and I appreciate it, and it suits me well.
That's wonderful, Michael. And one of the things I also wanted to ask you was what you had written in your acceptance speech when you got the award of merit at ACIST, where you talked about your role as Jesus in one of the plays in your childhood, and how you got on to get the role of half a spider later on. So you want to talk about that briefly?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
About what?
Yeah, when you were a child, and when you got the part of Jesus in a play, I think.
Yes, at the age of 2 weeks, I took the lead role in the Nativity as baby Jesus, and I stole the show. Of course, I don't remember it, but if you start at that elevated level, it's meant that the rest of my life has been steadily going downhill.
Mm-hmm. And then the second role you got, you want to talk about the spider's role?
Well, the English have a genre of called pantomime. It's a little bit like burlesque, and it's very stylized. It has traditions and so on, and they're always they're usually based on a nursery rhyme.
Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. There came a spider and sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away.
Yes, that's exactly right. And when I was a teenager, a group of us formed an informal club by ourselves, and we were allowed to use the local church hall. And we put on this show for senior citizens.
Right.
And there were some songs, and there was a vivid reenaction of Miss Muffet being scared by a big spider. It was probably pretty pathetic, but the senior citizens loved it, especially because we would sing old songs from, the early 1900s that they knew. So that was fun. I've got a photograph of it somewhere, but...
Okay. And you got the role of half a spider because two people had to perform together and form the spider, you said.
To make a spider, you need 8 legs.
Right.
So if you're going to use humans, you can't do it with one person. You need 2 people, sort of one line crosswise on the other.
Right.
That way you get 4 arms, 4 legs equals 8. That was the best we could do, yes.
Yeah, and so you said how from the lead role of Jesus to the role of half a spider was a downhill for you.
That's not normally anybody's trajectory of success.
No, I think you've had a huge trajectory of success. I think both the role of Jesus and the half a spider have been very lucky for you, I think, in many ways. I think you continue to be an inspiration for a lot of people, including me.
Well, there's lots of interesting problems to work on. There really is. And there really is a need for problems in the field to be worked on. And there's problems. I guess this is another piece of advice, especially that I give to doctoral students. I love to give advice to doctoral students. It's critical to formulate a research program in terms of a problem. If you can't define a problem, you won't know when you've got the answer and can stop. And if there isn't a problem, why are you doing it?
Right.
So formulating something as a problem, even if it takes a little ingenuity, is really important, because otherwise you don't have a good way of choosing a methodology or knowing how to proceed, or indeed for a dissertation when you can stop. So problems are important, not only because they need solving, but also as a way of formulating how to proceed.
And it gives you something to do, something meaningful to do, I think. And the more meaningful the problems are, the
Yes.
more valuable your work is. And earlier you talked about picking things that are useful or relevant when you're picking problems to solve or research areas to work on. And I think that's because there's one of the things which Professor Sander Ardele's once told me was that there's nothing called a low-hanging fruit. And I think that's because anything you do ultimately ends up becoming a lot of effort. So it is better to take things that are worthwhile.
Yes.
To pick, because it will be a lot of effort in any case.
Well, you never quite know what's going to be low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
It might be. I mean, my thing on information as thing, I mean, if I hadn't written that, sooner or later somebody else would. I mean, in hindsight, it's obvious. It just wasn't obvious to me to begin with. The problem was that when I went from the special theory of library services in theory and context to the broader theory of all manners of information services based on collections, there was a practical semantic problem. In the first case, I could just talk about library materials. But you can't do that when you're not talking about libraries anymore.
Right.
I mean, it sounds trivial, but to finish the book, I needed some term to refer to the stuff that was in the collections. I couldn't say library materials. And that was really, it was a semantic problem in the writing of the book that I was stuck with. And we rented an apartment looking out over the beach near Sydney. And I would get up early as the sun came up over the Pacific, and then I would go to the hot bread shop and get a nice new loaf while my wife made coffee. I mean, it makes it nostalgic, but it was there that I worked. What am I going to call this stuff? And the obvious answer was information, but information has been used by so many people to mean so many different things.
Right.
So how could you address that? So I thought, well, the obvious thing is to just try to sort the different uses of the word information into piles and see how many piles I've got.
Right.
And I ended up with 3 piles, which I then called information as thing and information as process and information as knowledge. And that seemed to be, to first approximation, 3 relatively self-contained piles.
Right.
And so I put that in the book. And then I thought, well, I had to think about that. So maybe that might be of interest to other people. And then I said, no, I said to myself, it's too obvious. It's silly to write a paper on that. I put it in the book, but it's silly to write an article. And then I thought, well, on the other hand, if I'd had to think about it, then maybe a few other people haven't thought about it and it might be of interest. So I'll work up a little paper anyway and send it in.
Right.
That's how that paper nearly didn't get written.
No, so I think I'm glad it got written, and it's kind of mandatory reading now for anybody taking any course in information science or information behavior. And whenever you talk about information versus knowledge, or what is information, so I think among other articles, that article stands out like pretty much on the top, and it's always there.
Well, that's, I guess I was the first person to write that particular line. I think sooner or later somebody else would have come up with something similar.
Right.
So it's nice to get to be the first person to do it. And I also like the fact that I could incorporate some awareness of the earlier work before 1945 of other people.
Right. And also it is semantically important to think about what, even though information is so commonly used, but to really think about what the categories of information are
Yes,
and how do we conceptualize it.
yes.
So thank you, Professor Buckland. I know that I keep going to Professor Buckland and you want me to call you Michael. But thank you so much, Michael. And this has been amazing. And I've always wanted to interview you. So it's one of those days that when I feel like, okay, it's an important day.
We're talking about my favorite topic, and I'm easily found.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.